Hello, folks. Welcome back to World War II TV and the last show for a few days because I'm conducting my annual Normandy tour starting in a couple of days. So you've got lots of time over the next few days to catch up on all the shows you've missed. Anyway, so far, the generals we have covered in this leadership series will have been familiar to most of you, Rommel, Montgomery, MacArthur. Today, however, we look at a commander fairly well known, although my guests might argue otherwise in France, but less so elsewhere. Monique and Jason, two of the three historians behind this book, join us. I'll hold up my copy there. And as always, the links to purchasing the book are in the description below, or you can find it wherever you get your books. So that's the commercial bit out of the way. I'll bring my guests in. So good afternoon. How are you both today?
Thank you so much, Paul. Happy to be here with you.
Good.
Yes,
so
great.
We were just talking before going live, Monique, about how even within France, how not terribly known this general is. And I'll let you begin your presentation shortly, and a very private man. And I think before we begin, I just want to address both of you, the fact that we were talking about the ethical nature of if someone doesn't want to be talked about, is it okay to talk about them all these years later? So, I mean, the audience won't have heard what we said, but my feeling was if you've become a general, you've kind of in the public sphere, you've been leading men in combat, therefore you're kind of in the public domain. Would you agree with that, Jason?
I would. I think you're right. And he may not have wanted that attention and that publicity, but yet here we are now, a couple of generations later, and I think we have things to learn from him. And so. Yeah, absolutely. He was in the public domain, and I wanted.
Monique, you felt the same, didn't you?
Absolutely. And especially as an educator, I think the more role model we can find for the next generation, the better it will be.
And within French history, I mean, like Churchill in British history, de Gaulle just looms enormously large. You know, de Gaulle just sort of sits over everything. Even General Leclerc and other people, just Jean Moulin, I guess, from the French resistance point of view. But yes. De Gaulle does kind of monopolize everything into how everybody around the world perceives French military history. So it's we're really pleased that you're going to give us someone else to talk about. So I'll bring your slides up. So folks, because it's two guests, we'll let the two of them juggle between it, but we'll probably focus on most of the questions at the end of the show today, if there are any, of course, because you may not know enough to ask questions. But if there's any ones about particular details on the slides, far away, and I'll put it to my guests as we go along. But basically, I'm going to hand it over to Monique and Jason to tell us about someone, and we'll all sit back and learn today. It's a big, steep learning curve for us all today.
Thank you so much, Paul. I would like first to explain why General Michel and I launched on this adventure to write a book about General Dio. As far as I'm concerned, French by birth and American by choice, born in Carthage and raised in Rome, I always had a passion for archaeology and ancient Africa, which led me to a PhD in history at the Sorbonne before moving to Atlanta. And in 2014, I was asked to serve on the US World War I Centennial Commission. When in 2019, General Michel, who at the time was president of the foundation of Maréchal Leclerc, approached me to see if I would help write a book on my godfather. General Michel had served in Africa. He commanded the Regiment de Marche du Tchad, the RMT, which my godfather commanded in World War II. He was also president of the Maison des Anciens de la Deuxième DB, like the Veteran Association of the 2nd Armored Division. No book had ever been written on General Dio, nor did he write his memoirs or a book on World War II. And as a trained historian, also not a military historian, I felt, after helping for many years commemorating the sacrifice of Americans in World War I, it was my duty to help remember my godfather because he had no children due to an injury he sustained at the Battle of Kufra, which we will talk about later. So this book is really an homage coming from me to my godfather, to my father, and to all the people whom I grew up with, including General de Gaulle. And so now we move to the second slide. And I wanted to explain that here you see those three different images of Dio. First at Saint-Cyr, he's 18 years of age then. And he is already admitted at the age of 18, which means 1 year ahead of the normal student coming to Saint-Cyr. And we title this slide Unknown in the Shadow of a Giant of French History. He was unknown of his own choice. And I think all goes back to his a tragedy in his childhood. Once I started researching his life, I find an article in the Courrier du Morbihan, a newspaper in Brittany, from August 8, 1914, who relates the suicide of his father on August 4, 1914, the day the Germans invaded France. And it stated, suicide of an officer, Victor Dio shot himself in the head with his revolver. Overwhelmed by the responsibility of mobilization, his mental state was deeply affected. The reason is the only explanation of the fatal gesture of an officer. He was held in high esteem by all. Having dealt so much with World War I and thinking that France had lost 1.3 million men, and that while Dio was going to school, he had the children of all those French soldiers in the same classroom. And it was known that his father had committed suicide on the day the Germans invaded instead of fighting. And I felt that gave him an extraordinary courage and a desire to prove that a Dio is not afraid to fight. So for this reason, he worked very hard, but then was at Saint-Cyr. Then another reason why he should be known is that in 1945, he became a general at age 37, the youngest general of the French army of the 20th century. So this is another reason not to be forgotten. And finally, I want to show this last picture when he retires as general of the army. And here are his goodbye in 1969 at the Invalid. And another reason that, also moved me tremendously is that here is a picture of my godfather. Here is Michel Debré, Minister of Defense, who was married to my godmother. So here are two men who had a major influence on me growing up. So here we are on, sorry, my apologies. Soon I will let Jason talk. And finally, I want to share with you this next slide, which is his will. And in his will, I may not need to, I will read it for you, but you can read it. For my funeral, I don't want any military honors, no flowers, no wreaths, no speeches, no flags of veterans. The conscripted priest should not mention any word outside of the ritual ones. I don't want any commemorative plaque. We are already short of space. I want to be laid to rest like an anonymous person, which I had never ceased to be at the bottom of my heart during my whole life.
And we talked about that before going live, Monique. I mean, that and Jason, that is so ungeneral-like. We've done MacArthur this week and Rommel and Montgomery, who are still vying for publicity after their deaths. I mean, they still want to be talked about. And yet you've got someone here, as you said, youngest general in the French army of the 20th century, general of the army. And as we'll find out later on, you name it, he was there all the way through. And yet he wants to just fade away. No last hurrah. I mean, how ungeneral-like, Jason?
Yeah, I can't think of a good American counterpart to Dio, but it would be closer to Omar Bradley, someone who was more of a soldier and happened to rise to very high rank and position, but yet at the heart of it wanted to be an anonymous, regular soldier. And Bradley wasn't quite the same way as Dio, nor was his experiences as epic. But that's the closest I can come up with. Dio was definitely not the three men you mentioned, Montgomery, Rommel, or MacArthur.
Yeah. Anyway, back to you two to carry on. This is great.
Yes, so that is my next slide. Shows you the extent of the book and the size of the epic story of Dio alongside Leclerc from Cameroon in 1940 to Germany in 1945. And now we are going to start with the beginning of the story, and when we see Dio as a Méharistes. And I let Jason now speak more about
so
it.
I'll start by saying that I'm a French historian, primarily of the French Revolution, Napoleonic era, and going up through World War I. So World War II, not exactly my specialty, but still a French historian. And I have even met, in 2005, I met some of the veterans of the French 2nd Armored Division. And I know the story of Leclerc, and of course I know de Gaulle. But even I was not aware of Louis Dio until I met Monique, and she began to share him with me. And so it has been truly fascinating as I've gone through this project to learn more about him. And I'm really excited to be able to share who he was to the rest of the world, to an English-speaking world. So Dio graduated from Saint-Cyr, from the military academy, and chose to go into the colonial troops rather than into the Metropolitan Army and serve as a Méhariste, a Méhariste, or a camel soldier. So he was in the deserts on camel, and you can kind of see what that looks like here in some of these images. He spent the first 10 years of his career in what was then called French Sudan, now Mali, then Mauritania and Chad, which is where he was when the war broke out over there, and where the yellow arrow is, commanding a group of tirailleurs sénégalais, which is an infantry formation of indigenous soldiers. And they were called Senegal tirailleurs or Senegalese riflemen, even though this isn't in Senegal, kind of in the whole region of French West Africa had this designation for its indigenous infantry. So you can see here what it meant to be a Méhariste. Is you see Dio and others up there with the camels. It was more of a on the ground and austere life, required even low-level officers to exercise a great deal of autonomy, because they're out there on the frontiers of empire and oftentimes operating on their own. And so it builds a lot of autonomy and, I would think, confidence in yourself and in your soldiers. You'd have to have that. You see these long camel raids that are depicted there. And then in the corner there, you see Dio at a meal, and you can't really see, he's got his shoes off. He's sitting cross-legged on the ground. They're eating. And so being in the colonial army also meant that you had to learn a lot of variety of indigenous cultures, languages, which Dio did, understand who the power structures are and how they're related to each other, understand the terrain and the topography. Where are the wells, for example, across this vast terrain? So it required a skill set that was very different than that you would find in the Metropolitan Army in Europe. And it's worth noting also that The French West Africa, where he was operating for those first 10 years, is about 4.7 million square kilometers, a couple of million square miles, which was about 8 times the size of metropolitan France. So you've got this handful of these soldiers out there who are operating this vast territory, and in a lot of ways figuring things out on their own. Mm. All right, back to you, Monique.
And so on August 28th in Douala, the Méharistes meets the Cavalier. And you can see the Méharistes and the way he lived. I remember my godfather had a very hard time wearing shoes because he had spent so many years in the desert that it was very difficult for him to adapt to urban life. But now I let Jason speak really about the major difference between the Méharistes and the Cavalier.
I just have to clarify this for an American audience, is that when we think of the cavalryman in the United States tradition, we think of primarily the frontier, the Indian Wars. You think of the men out on the horse in the dirt, out on the frontier, and that's not the French tradition. The French tradition in culture, the cavalier is aristocratic, noble, going back to the time when the cavalry had to provide their own horses and their own retinue. And so you see a man like Leclerc here on the right, who was aristocratic and maybe a bit stodgy, prim and proper, the exact opposite, the antithesis of the colonial camel soldier that Dio was. And you can just see that really well in this image. So when we say cavalier or cavalryman in the French culture, we're thinking of something totally different than we would in the American system.
Thank you.
And so on that day, on August 28, when Leclerc arrives in Douala, mandate by General de Gaulle to start winning over the French colonies, because as you know, in his famous appeal of June 18, he stated, France has lost the battle, but didn't lose the war. It has still an empire and so on. I don't need to repeat this part. And so when Leclerc, just before Leclerc arrived in Douala, he was told that there was an officer who did not speak, who was very silent, but if he could win over that officer, then he will be winning over Cameroon, because he will have also his unit at his disposal. And so during the time Leclerc was making his presentation to the people assembled in the home of a local colonial doctor, at some point he saw Dio get up and leave. And so Leclerc asked, Dio, are you with me or not? And Dio answered, I am going to get my men. And that's how what is known in France as les Trois Glorieuses, the 3 glorious days, started. And then, as you can see from the slide, in the next few days, in the next 3 days, in fact, when Chad, Cameroon, and Middle Congo rallied to the Gaulle, they provided Free France with crucial territory, resources, and more importantly, political legitimacy and a power base in Africa. And there is one of the writers sort of wrote that de Gaulle was transformed from a squatter on the bank of the Thames into the leader of a tangible government. And Churchill, during the war, when his people around him were questioning his decision and were sort of afraid, always said, remember Douala as a sign. You can attempt the impossible. And so you can see on the map all those countries. And I have put a lot of map on the slides because, as Jason explained, you know, this is such a vast territory and often unfamiliar to many people.
Yeah.
And so now we have this slide, and I will let Jason.
Well, one of the things that fascinated me about not just Dio and Leclerc, but this whole time here in these early days in Africa at the beginning of the war was you're just trying to imagine as a soldier myself the difficulty of decision and which side do we go with, and the tension between loyalty to your superiors and to your country and loyalty to what you feel like the right cause should be. And Marshal Pétain, who had taken control of the Vichy government, was a hero in so many eyes, and so do you go against Pétain and join this unknown squatter on the Thames, de Gaulle, with what seems to be right? So there's so many conflicts in here, and you see that early on in Gabon after the Les Trois Glorieuses, when most of French Equatorial Africa had rallied to de Gaulle, there was still the challenge of Gabon. And as Dio moved down, his biggest concern, one of his main concerns, was fighting other Frenchmen, because that's what this fight was going to be, as you're trying to rally others to the cause. And so the hope would be that you could persuade those in French territory to join with de Gaulle, but that would mean convincing them to go against Pétain and go against what was honestly the legitimate government of France. And so it was a difficult thing. Do we fight if they don't agree? And so that's what happened. As Dio advanced southward from Cameroon, you see a couple of other columns under Perrin and Delange coming from the south, all moving in on Gabon. And Dio came across there at, you see Ngomo and Mitsik up in the kind of the eastern part there, in kind of northeastern part of Gabon. As Dio was coming down towards Ngomo, he found out that the commander in Mitsik was an old classmate of his from Saint-Cyr, and he was still loyal to Vichy, a man named Bellon. But Dio didn't want to fight him. So they kind of reached out and they spoke, and Dio was able to get from him an assurance of something like a neutrality. That Bellon said, "I'm not going to fight you, but I can't join you because my commanding officer is still with Vichy, and so I have to follow orders from my commanding officer." So there's like these conflicts that are going on. So Dio and his column did pass through Ngomo, but then began to take some shots from the rear as he went through. And so there's this: do you trust the Vichy Frenchmen? Is it just their indigenous soldiers who have fought you? And so there's difficulties of all that. And so that was going on throughout what we're talking about here in Equatorial Africa. But what Dio learned from coming through Ngomo and taking some shots from some Vichy troops was that he had to take Mitsik, but maybe he could go around it. Maybe he could bypass it. That way he could avoid fighting against other Frenchmen and still move on towards his objective further south. And so as he tried to bypass, he split his force up a little bit. And one of his subunits was commanded by a reservist lieutenant who in his regular life was a veterinarian. And that lieutenant got lost as he was moving his force through the jungle and spun around a little bit and came back into his own column. And so he wound up with some fratricidal fighting not against Vichy French, but against his own Free Frenchmen that happened for a little bit there. And miraculously, there were no casualties. But I say all that, and tell this whole story here just to illustrate just how difficult it was, particularly in those early days, with inexperience, with questioned loyalties, add the terrain, and just so many things going on that such a chaotic, confusing scenario there as everyone was still trying to get their feet and their loyalties underneath them.
Why I think Western historians just kind of ignore it. I mean, this is the same period where even explaining what's happening in metropolitan France is complicated because the French army's been defeated. It's the burgeoning days of resistance movements and political movements and opposition. Things like, but this area here, I mean, it's noticeable that your forward is by Michael Nyberg, because he's one of the few people your side of the pond who's even attempted to kind of unravel colonial and the empire of France, because it's new to most people watching this, but how much fight there was. And the same, by the way, in 1914, a generation earlier.
Yeah, and honestly, it's hard for us to imagine the level of prestige that Philippe Pétain had in France as well, and so to go against him was a big decision. Yeah. All right. So then, following following their victory in Gabon and rallying Equatorial Africa, all of Equatorial Africa now to free France, de Gaulle appointed Leclerc to be the military commander of Chad, which means going all the way back up from south to north, back up to Chad, and in order to prepare to invade Italian Libya, which was, you'll find that we're going to take the fight from other Frenchmen towards the Axis powers. So all the way back up north to Chad. But you notice there's not just the Libyan army to the north. To reiterate what I've just been saying, notice there in Niger, you see the flag of Vichy France. And so as Leclerc and Dio were oriented north towards Libya, they had to also be worried about their flank to the west in Niger and whether those soldiers in Niger would support Vichy or if they would let them go through in some sort of neutrality. So Leclerc sent his what he was recognizing was his best man, Dio, to the frontier with Niger and gave Dio the authorization to reach across the border to talk to some of the people over there to see what he could do. And he was able to secure some level of neutrality among the Vichy soldiers there to allow these Free French soldiers now to invade into Libya. So that unit of Free French troops that was coalescing around Leclerc was called Colonne Leclerc, or Leclerc's column, for a while, and then eventually, as it gets up into Tunisia, took on the name Force L. And so thus far, as we've seen in these early months, Leclerc and Dio had been fighting to rally Free France to de Gaulle, or French territory to de Gaulle and to free France. But now, here at the end of 1940, they're finally going to confront the Axis powers. And I just, again, I'm going to keep saying this, but I want to emphasize the distances that we're talking about on here. And if you look at this map, the distance from Fort Lamy down in the south part of Chad there at Lake Chad, from Fort Lamy up to Faya-Largeau is about 1,000 kilometers, 600 miles. And it's about that far again from there up into the Italian base at Kufra. So we're talking about 1,200 miles, 2,000 kilometers that they're going to have to move across rough desert that is sometimes really, really deep and soft sand. At other times, it was rocks that would shred tires on vehicles and with not a lot of support in between. So throughout this whole African campaign, which we're just going to cover in a few slides, and boom, 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 they've done it. We're talking about serious difficulties just to move from point A to point B. And then when you add somebody shooting at you, it takes on a whole other dimension.
And again, it's that wonderful perspective we have of being British. I think of the North African campaign as being that sliding along the coast to Brook, Alexandria, and really not really venturing inland. But then you're reminding us that the Free French are coming from basically the middle of Africa all the way up for all the different terrains, as you're implying now, is that it blows out of the water our British and perhaps Australian perceptions of the fighting in North Africa, because in fact it's not even just North Africa, it's Africa.
Right, agree. Crossing the Sahara, if you will, in some makeshift vehicles that they'd pull together without all these reinforcing aircraft to bring in supplies, their water. It took all this great deal of knowledge that had been gained by colonial troops moving through this area over the years. Where are the wells? Where are the potential populations we can seek support from? Where can we move? But once you go into Libya, that's all gone, because now you're moving into Italian territory, not French territory. So I'm going to keep saying it, but just the challenges that they have here. And so we're going to spend the next few slides kind of talking through some of all this. But while we're on this slide real quick, I'll show that to the right of the two arrows going into Libya, you'll see the French attack on the base at Kufra. Yep. And then another arrows going off to the left through an area of Libya called Fezzan, and then into Tunisia. So we're going to follow those two routes in these next few slides. All right. Monique, you're muted, I think.
I'm muted.
Yeah, there's a bit of feedback. I muted you when you weren't talking. Don't worry. You're back in.
Okay, no. I just wanted to mention that on July 18, 1941, Dio was made Compagnon de la Libération, which is an order that de Gaulle had created. And Leclerc had received the same honor on March 6, 1941. Leclerc received this decoration from the hand of General de Gaulle that same year, because de Gaulle kept flying to Africa thanks to the generosity of the British. who gave him an airplane to fly there. But also Dio was supposed to be decorated on the same day. He was not present during the ceremony due to the injury we are going to mention now at the Battle of Kufra.
So part of what makes this story so amazing is the diverse mixture of units and characters that keep showing up throughout it. It's like these random things that just are totally surprising. For this attack on Kufra that's coming up, this was the major Italian base in the southern part of Libya there, and so they knew that they were going to have to hit that and to make a statement. That we're going after the Axis forces here for the first time. There was also an Italian air base down there that Italian Ghibli aircraft were coming and bombing the French and the British who were in the area. So they needed to deal with that. But along the way, there's this mixture of units who keep showing up. One of them is the British Long Range Desert Group, which was a group of mounted desert raiders that also included a patrol of New Zealanders. So we've got in the middle of all this thing, some Kiwis have shown up for an attack on a Free French attack on Italians in Libya. And some of those Free French were still mounted on camelback at this point. So the reconnaissance and harassing raids that are going on out here were led and supported the attack on the Italian airfield at Merzouk were done by this bizarre combination of truck-mounted Kiwis and camel-mounted Frenchmen and Chadians, attacking an Italian airbase. It's like these crazy kind of scenarios that you try to wrap your head around. And so that's what happened. The long-range desert group and some of still the Méharistes attacked the airbase at Merzouk, destroyed some of the Italian aircraft, seized the base, and could then move on to Kufra, which is you're seeing in this slide here. And after seizing that airbase, they could then move on to the Fort El Tag at Kufra. And then on the 17th of February, 1941, after another difficult desert movement through unknown terrain at this point, and more Italian planes that were continuing to bomb the column as they moved forward, the French finally made it to Fort El Tag and surrounded the fort there. And over the course of the next week, they besieged this Italian fort, conducted night attacks looking for a weak point. Their artillery was dragging behind because it had been stuck in the sand, and a lot of the vehicles and heavy weapons were still delayed, but most of the lighter part of the force got to the fort and began to besiege the Italians inside the fort. Dio recognized after a few days that they really needed their artillery up there, and one of his soldiers just happened to have found a horse that belonged to the Italian commander of the base, but it was in a place where at night you could sneak in and grab the horse, which they did. But then Dio jumped on this horse and rode right in front of the Italian fort, taking shots on all sides, sand popping up. You can imagine the scenario from a movie as Dio was riding this stolen horse out of the Italian stables in front of the fort there. And he got away, was not wounded as he did that. And then he galloped off, got the artillery, pulled it forward. You brought them forward so they could figure out a way to get to the fort, and then began to really go after the fort and start making some headway. But still, it was difficult to get in. So more night attacks, more harassing attacks. After about a week, Dio decided to lead one of those attacks himself. And in the middle of the night, on an 8-hour patrol, moving forward inch by inch, he came across some Italians who were armed with grenades and was, as you can see in this picture, pretty severely wounded. And then evacuated ultimately by aircraft, evacuated by an Italian aircraft that they had acquired and flown all the way back to Fort Lamy in Chad, where Dio spent several months convalescing. And this image right here that was taken coincidentally by an American film crew who just happened to be at Fort Lamy at the time. And so you get this image of Dio coming back. But if you'll go to the next slide, what that meant for Dio was he missed this capture of Kufra because he'd been evacuated right in the final moments there. But he and his soldiers had facilitated being able to finally get into Fort El Tag at Kufra and take it. And this became one of the greatest moments, really the starting moment of the famous part of Leclerc's epic, where Leclerc stood out and gave what is now known as the Oath of Kufra, swearing that we will not lay down our weapons until our colors fly over the Strasbourg Cathedral. And so Dio missed this moment. But I want to point out here, he says Strasbourg. Leclerc says we're going to fly our flag over Strasbourg, not Paris. Paris was implied. We're going to make it to Paris. We're going to liberate Paris, and we're going to move on. But Strasbourg was important because we're talking about the capital of Alsace, which had so often been a point of contention between the Germans and the French, and had been lost from 1870 until 1918, and then retaken by the Germans again at the beginning of World War II. So what he's talking about is we will liberate all of France to include Alsace from the Germans, and at that point we can finally lay down our arms. When we get there, we're going to see that's not true because they advance into Germany as well. But that was the oath.
And I just wanted to mention, because it's a constant reminder of Dio, this scarf that was given to my mother and that I have at home, which is about the oath of Kufra and shows all the different units that were part of the French 2nd Armored Division.
So this is a great image here on the right, taken at Gatroun. Dio's looking like the desert Méharistes that he was, dirty. I mean, he's the one on the far right there with the beard. His hat's kind of worn out. He's wearing shorts, smoking a cigarette. He looks like he's lost a lot of weight. He's really thin right there. And then you look over to next to him in the middle of the picture there is Leclerc, who's somewhat in transition. So Leclerc, I told you, I emphasized that the cavalry tradition in France is one of the aristocratic noble and prim and proper, and that's what he was. And at first that brought a lot of suspicion from the colonial soldiers that had gathered around the fight for free France in Africa. And he was a bit stiff, and Dio helped Leclerc to kind of relax a little bit and to adopt some of the customs and character of the colonial troops. And you see in this picture, in this image, he's kind of part of the way there. He's still wearing his metropolitan blue coat, with probably still had the silver insignia of rank that the cavalry would wear. Infantry wore gold rank insignia, and the cavalry wore silver. So he's probably still wearing that, but he's wearing these big puffy pants that were worn by the colonial soldiers out in the desert. So he's kind of the mix there. And it was Dio who helped Leclerc kind of unwind a little bit and start to see how to win over some of his troops. And
he's reminding me a little bit, Jason and Monique, of General Slim out in India and Burma. That sort of embracing the multicultural aspect, embracing the terrain you're fighting in, rather than kind of being scared of it. There's a sort of a parallel, I think, with that. There are some commanders who go into theaters and kind of afraid of it and try and impose maybe their staff college thinking. But Dio seems to just be, no, this is the environment. I'm gonna, this is the way to do it. Do how the locals do it, and it's a mindset, I think.
Right, and it's not just what you've learned in the staff college. Just as a commander, I think we're often taught to impose your style, your character on the unit. That you're to make the unit you in a way, and the colonial tradition was totally backwards from that, and understanding that we have to adapt to the local customs and cultures, and Dio was able to get Leclerc to understand that and see that he needed to start adapting his own style to meet the unit and the location as well. All right, so here we see Fezzan 2, the first time moving into Libya at Kufra. Then second we get the first Fezzan operation. Was a series of harassing raids and reconnaissance missions, armed reconnaissance that moved up into Fezzan. And from these first operations in Libya, the goal was to gain intelligence and to determine what the best way of movement would be to continue to move north and try to link up with the British. And so we got two operations, Fezzan 1, Fezzan 2. And the first one was, you can kind of look at it as an armed training mission. We're going to go in and fight, but that fighting is really learning the terrain, learning the environment, learning how to fight. And a lot of lessons came out of Fezzan 1, and so now Fezzan 2 was we're going to move through and seize Italian territory and link up with the British outside of Tunisia. And so taking those lessons learned, Dio and his men modified their equipment. They had cut the cabs off their trucks. They'd found out ways to move through the sand, ways to maintain their vehicles, medical support, how to move the artillery. They learned a lot of lessons in those first operations in Libya. And so in December of 42, they launched Fezzan 2. And during the course of a month, what was becoming known as Force L, advanced Force L for Leclerc, advanced through Libya, and Dio in the lead was the first one. Eventually, through all the fighting here that we're speeding through quickly, was the first one to reach the coast there at Tripoli. And there we go. So we see one thing that if you go back to that last slide, I want to point out is you see Leclerc there. I'm sorry, go ahead forward. There, right there. You see Leclerc wearing a kepi, which is different than the hat he was wearing when I said he was in transition. Monique, I think, is going to talk about that kepi a little bit, but I want to say that he's wearing the 2 stars on there of a brigadier general. And in the French system, a brigadier general wears 2 stars. He had been given that promotion by de Gaulle before Kufra, based on building this force and getting ready to attack in Kufra. De Gaulle had promoted Leclerc to brigadier general, but Leclerc refused to wear that insignia, refused to even tell his soldiers about the promotion until he felt like he had earned it. And so after Kufra, he felt he had finally earned the promotion that he'd already been given, and he put on that hat with his 2 stars. Now, Monique, you want to tell us about the hat?
Or just briefly, that the hat was really a contraption created from something that is locally worn by the locals, and the stars were taken from some Italian uniforms. And so that is how this first general hat of Leclerc was fashioned.
Yeah. So although de Gaulle promoted him, they weren't riding around with a box of general stars in their kit. So they had to take them from the Italians and then make this homemade kepi for him to show that. Okay, so I'm speeding through a lot of this here, but having advanced through Libya, Force L finally met up with the British 8th Army in Tunisia for the campaign that maybe a lot more of us are familiar with, and were assigned this Force L is growing. So it's a unit that continued to grow by adding more and more elements of Frenchmen and others from all over the place who were joining. So it was growing, dubbed Force L now for this campaign through Tunisia, and given the mission by Montgomery to guard the flank of Montgomery's 8th Army's advance through. So now, having been an independent operator all the way up through all these campaigns in Equatorial Africa and then into Libya, now fall under British command in 1943 with the mission to guard the flank of the 8th Army coming through there. And so what we get here at this point, Dio commanded about 1,500 men and fought at places like Kasar Galem, where we're going to see this plaque here against German armored forces. They were fighting landmines for the first time, so now they're learning some new things now that the Germans had become the enemy for their first time. And Montgomery was successful, as we know, and he gave some credit to Leclerc for guarding that flank. And in this period, a lot more lessons learned about now beginning to fight major combat operations on a more traditional sense, as opposed to the desert raids that had been going on.
It's all becoming a bit more sort of slick and professional. So the independent nature of sort of 41, 42 is transitioning into a more sort of divisional core base. And I just can't help but add some extra factoids from Trevor Sheehan, our Tunisia expert. The German attack on El Force was led by Hans von Luck, who comes into the story later in Normandy, and they were the flank guard for the 2nd New Zealand Corps. So thanks, Trevor. Trevor is our, as I say, resident Tunisia expert, and you're coming on in October or November, aren't you, Trevor, to do some more Tunisia stuff. So I love it when people watching are adding to the people presenting. It's that great sharing of knowledge that we do here on World War II TV. So thanks, Trevor. We had a question for Trevor, Jason, for both of you, Monique as well. How did Dio and Leclerc get on? Leclerc would have had massive moments of anger with his subordinates. His temper was possibly caused by combat injury to his brain. So from what reading your book, there's sort of there's respect and an admiration and some fondness, but some tension, a bit of everything. Would that be fair?
I think so. There were a lot of people who did not get along with Leclerc, and from my reading of Monique's work here, you can see this mutual respect. It was clear, the mutual respect between Dio and Leclerc, and Dio commented about something a lot of other people noticed too, is Leclerc's steely gaze. That he fixed you with his presence, and Dio talks a lot about Leclerc's presence, and in exchange, Leclerc understood that Dio was really the essential man for this fight. He had already gained a reputation even before the war had started. As a colonial soldier, he had already been decorated for operations, raids, and counter raids that he'd been doing in the 1930s. And Leclerc had been told, if you get Dio on your side, as Monique said, then all will go well. And he understood that. He knew that this man is very different from me, but he understands what he's doing, and he's got the respect of his soldiers.
Brilliant. Thank you.
And in fact, the picture I'm showing you now is the plaque commemorating the Battle of Ksar-Rilan, which states here from February 23rd to March 10, 1943, General Leclerc with the Force L arriving from Chad sustained victoriously the assault of the enemy forces, inflicting onto them heavy losses. And today the place looks totally like the desert, and you had those camels sort of sitting near around. And it was a trip organized by the Maison des Anciens de la Deuxième DB, and I was fortunate to be part of this trip led by General Michel, and there were 3 grandchildren of General Leclerc as part of this trip. So in May, the Force L, after Tunisia, the Force L became the 2nd Free French Division and moves to Libya, where all their new recruits will be trained. And then that is a very sad part of this story, because they had to be whitened. The French expression meaning blanchir, at the request of the American. But this was a requirement of the Americans, who had agreed that a French division serving in their rank to have a French division serving in their rank to open a second Atlantic front. So everybody is very sad, but they keep moving, and they arrive on August 2nd in Morocco, driving again through Tunisia and then Algeria. And on the way, they continue to add a very large number of recruits, as you can see here.
And by this point, by the time we made it to Casablanca in preparation to move to Britain for that invasion that we now know as D-Day, you open up in Normandy. So they've been moved under American command from the Brits to the Americans, and therefore changed uniforms, changed equipment, got tanks, got tank destroyers, all these new machine guns. So there was a lot of training that had to go into all that, but they were also adding soldiers to it. And so I just want to point out that by the time the North African campaign ended for this unit, that was the 2nd Free French Division, and then eventually renamed to the 2nd Armored Division, or the Deuxième Division Blindée, or the Deuxième DB, that this unit consisted of colonial troops, including indigenous Africans, until the Americans said they had to get rid of them, from across West Africa and French Equatorial Africa. There were metropolitan troops who had fled when France fell and looked for a way to fight. So they had moved to the colonies, and many of them made their way down to what became the 2nd Armored Division. It included some French sailors who no longer had ships. And so some French sailors were now going to be manning tank destroyers as part of an armored division on land. And there was even a company of Spanish Republicans who were living in exile in North Africa after the Spanish Civil War, and they joined as well. So one of the companies in the 2nd Armored Division was made up of Spaniards. And so it's this eclectic group of people who had in common the desire to liberate France from German oppression. And so as Monique said, that the Chadians were sent away to either go back home or to join other units who were remaining in Africa. But what was left of the 2nd Armored Division then prepared to sail to England.
Yes, but they were not only men, and I just am inserting this because I think it's very important to remember that in the 2nd French Armored Division served the Rochambelles, which you see on the first picture on the ship to England, and there were at that time, the only French unit on the Atlantic coast with the 2nd Armored Division. And then you have another picture here later on in Fontainebleau of Florence Conrad, who created the Rochambelles. And this is a fantastic story. Florence Conrad was American, many American women. She had a group of American women and a dozen American women, and they purchased 19 ambulances, and they will join. And when they were to set sail to England, the American transporters refused to let them on board. No woman allowed. And General Leclerc stepped in. They are not women, they are ambulance driver. So anyhow, there is a fantastic book, and you probably know that, called Woman of Valor.
Yeah, Ellen has been on the channel. She's in the sidebar watching. She's really pleased. She's been on twice, I think. So yeah, we've done the I'll put the link in later on to Ellen's Rochambelles show. But yeah, we've covered that one. So that fantastic stuff. Back to you.
So here we are in England.
If I can, I just want to give a really quick personal story. I know we're kind of rushing through this, but 20 years ago, I was having dinner in Paris with some veterans of the French 2nd Armored Division, and was sitting at a table with a man who was telling me his amazing story. And there were 2 women at the table as well. And I finally got courageous and stupid enough to ask, so who are they? And the man said, oh yeah, they were ambulance drivers and medics in the 2nd Armored Division, and I stupidly said, oh, so they moved along behind the division as you attacked. And he got mad at me, and he said, no, they were in the division. They're my comrades, something along these lines. And then he told me, he said, the first time I met this woman, we were under fire, and she was patching up. I came to, I woke up, and she was patching me up as I'd been wounded, and we were still under fire. And so they were definitely very much a part of the division, and have been a part of this brotherhood and sisterhood ever since North Africa. All right, so we left off in Morocco, heading to the United Kingdom to get ready for the opening up the second front. And so the now Deuxième DB, the second French Armored Division, departed Morocco in several groups, April and May, so just before D-Day, a couple of months before D-Day of 1944. They arrived in the UK at the end of May, just right prior to the D-Day landings. And on the 5th of June, while still training and preparing to go across, they learned that Rome had fallen. And you start to hear some of the conversations about, we're not going to get the chance to get in. Well, then the very next day, they learned that the invasion of France had actually begun. They learned that when they saw all these planes flying overhead as they were training for the Normandy campaign. And it was clear that the invasion was on. And a lot of the soldiers from the 2nd Armored Division were afraid that they were going to miss their chance to be a part of this liberation. And that turned out not to be true, although it took a while. They finally embarked on August 1st and landed on Utah Beach on August 5th, or August 4th and 5th. So almost 60 days after D-Day, finally the 2nd Armored Division was able to land and was at that point attached to Wade Hayslip's 15th American Corps for the liberation of France. And you see them coming in ashore here with their Sherman tanks, tank destroyers ready to go. And by that point, the campaign in Normandy had, in some places, was moving quickly, in other places was a bit stalled. So they had not lost their chance to be a part of the liberation of France. And you can see here the path that's going to cut across France goes up into the Falaise pocket and then over to Paris and then to Strasbourg and into Germany itself. And so we're going to kind of follow through that path in these next few slides. The first chance for combat for the Deuxième DB, the 2nd Armored Division, was in the Falaise pocket. On the 10th of August, Hayslip's corps attacked from Le Mans toward Alençon. And Dio, unfortunately, just as it began, had some sort of a Jeep accident that he was a little bit quiet about himself, but we don't exactly know what happened, except he broke his ankle in the process of this Jeep accident just as the attack was beginning. And he refused treatment, which was true to his character. So he continued the advance. And his vanguard in this is still learning. Now it's a much bigger formation than they've been before. They're on armored vehicles. Dio commanded the infantry portion of the Second Armored Division, but that was still mounted on vehicles, and so still learning how to fight at another level and continuing to move up and become more sophisticated in the combined arms efforts and bringing in air forces and air power as well. But Dio was still this young, impetuous, camel soldier that he'd always been. And so here he was with a broken ankle in his Jeep, and he came across a village, and his advance guard was shot up pretty badly in this attack. And so he's making some adjustments. He decided to rearrange his formation, put his lightly armored Jeeps up forward to do reconnaissance, and then have the tanks right behind them, and then have the reconnaissance pull the tanks forward in successive bounds. And that was working for a while, but then eventually came across a village where there were Germans inside the houses that had to be pulled out slowly, house by house. And Dio got a little bit impatient, jumped in his Jeep, or was sitting in his Jeep because of his broken ankle, went around the village and wanted to see on the other side what he could find. And what he found was a German column in retreat, and he wound up right in the middle of it. And it engaged some shots, pulled back, found a platoon of his tanks, grabbed the tanks, told them, "Follow me," and then rode back into the middle of this German column, firing all the way through as he rushed through this German column, sending him into a panic. Now, this is just the commander of the regiment in his Jeep with a broken ankle, followed by 4 tanks. And they came flying through this German column, shooting, made it some way through the Germans before he realized maybe this isn't where I should be. Turned around, rode back through the column the second time, shooting on their way back out, gathered more troops. Then they went forward and secured the German surrender, which allowed him to pull his troops up. And now that earned him a lot of prestige with his soldiers. They loved it. It was great, but he recognized that was kind of stupid. And he was doing all this on a broken ankle as well. But it did help advance the unit forward, and they were able to take Carouge because of this. And so this was the Falaise pocket that if Dio being Dio again, just as he was when he was riding that Italian horse in front of Fort El Tag.
It seems he just carries on fighting this desert style, even though he's now in rural Normandy, because, if it works, it works. Although, as you say, recognizing that sometimes maybe a bit too gung-ho.
Right. Yeah. Which there's times when you have to recognize that, all right, maybe I shouldn't be doing this. And then there are times when you realize that, all right, the regimental commander's life is worth the risk at this point. And I think he recognized maybe that wasn't one of those points. It was just he was impatient and decided he needed to move forward. And luckily for him, he survived it all. And then after Falaise, there's the question of Paris. And this is a story that's probably a lot more well known. Eisenhower was not too keen on liberating Paris. Neither was Bradley.
At all. No, Bradley neither. No.
Yeah, these are a lot of mouths to feed. It's going to slow us down. It's going to get us bogged down into the scenario. And of course, de Gaulle was having none of that and fighting for what he saw as absolutely necessary, and that was liberating Paris. And he had, in fact, already told Leclerc, "You're going to go to liberate Paris, regardless of what the Americans who you're working for tell you." And so eventually, between Leclerc and de Gaulle working from above and below, they were able to convince Bradley and Eisenhower that this was necessary. And part of the calculation there was the French resistance within Paris had risen up. Yeah. And so it was going to leave them in a lurch. And we'd already seen after Operation Market Garden in the Netherlands had initially not succeeded, that the Dutch population suffered reprisals and a starvation winter after the Allied attempts at liberating the Netherlands. And so there was an understanding that there is a moral imperative as well to move into Paris. It's not just de Gaulle's vanity piece here. We've
had many discussions on the channel back in the last year, talking about the Allies' dilemma they're facing as you get into the late summer and early autumn of 1944, which is, are you trying to destroy the German army? Are you trying to make territorial or geographical gains, or are you trying to liberate peoples? And I have no problem living in France myself, that Leclerc and Dio are absolutely, we want to liberate French peoples. Why would they not? Anything else would be the wrong moral point of view from their point of view. Eisenhower and Bradley can take a more prosaic, more wider picture. But when people say, "Oh, well, the French were just doing what they wanted to do," yes, it's their country. I mean, I defend them to the hilt on that. I mean, if the situation was reversed and there was an Allied army moving through Britain, do you think the British or the English wouldn't go for London and the Scots wouldn't go for Glasgow and Edinburgh? Of course, it would. It's just, it's a representation of what the nation stands for. So, yeah, I find that really, I find criticism of them for wanting to go to Paris a bit strange, frankly.
Yeah, I do too. I usually say in their defense that, okay, from American command structure, you can see that both de Gaulle and Leclerc were a pain in the butt, but
yeah,
they were great Frenchmen. That was their first identity. Yeah, that's what they needed to do.
It's no different to MacArthur in the Philippines. It's personal. It's just who cares? I have no problem with it. I have no problem with them having a particularly unique French point of view there. It's natural. It would be weird if they didn't, I think.
Absolutely. And there was one other American in the equation here, and that's Leonard Guerrero, who was by this point Leclerc's corps commander, and Guerrero had called him that miserable little man or something to that effect. He was like, Leclerc's just this irritating, miserable man who I've got to deal with. But it was just really for this period here in Paris that Leclerc was working for Guerrero, because he's now going to go back to Hayslip after the liberation of Paris, a man that he got along with much better, a man who seemed to understand him. So here we see Leclerc and Dio on the right. After the liberation of Paris, on the left, you see the three groupements tactiques that formed, or you can call them battle groups, that formed the Second Armored Division, with Dio moving there in yellow into the heart of Paris. And so he had, for his part, so the Second Armored Division had the main effort going into Paris, reinforced, supported by the 4th U.S. Infantry Division. And Dio's part of that was through the center of Paris to the Eiffel Tower, the École Militaire, Les Invalides, and the National Assembly. So a key part there right in the middle of Paris. A lot of fighting, a lot of street fighting that was going on. The liberation of Paris was not a simple matter. And you can still see the holes in a lot of the walls and the buildings there that testify to that. So it was a tough fight, but Paris was finally liberated on the 25th, and there you see de Gaulle ready to do the parade. And so we've got waiting at the Arc de Triomphe is Dio and Leclerc standing side by side there.
And Dio is already in a kind of a position, is much less elegant, if you want, than Leclerc is. You see again the difference of looks in Dio is much more popular, I would say. Yeah. And that was something he was always remembered for his way of speech, which made him look much more like a guy from growing up in the streets. So anyhow, now they continue.
So after Paris, the division and the Allies continued to attack east, eventually into Lorraine and the Vosges Mountains, which you see on this map here. And so the eastern side of France. And that also means finally attacking across the Vosges into Alsace and Strasbourg, which had been their focal point ever since the Oath of Kufra. So the Germans had established two lines of defense, which you can kind of see on this map a little bit better on the second one. One to the west of the Vosges Mountains, a forward line, and then a second line on the Vosges Mountains themselves. And so this is where Dio and Leclerc and the Second Armored Division were attacking in the end of 1944. And so we'll go ahead and, well, I guess on here you can see the town of Saarburg up there in the north, where all the German flags are. This is going to be the first real test. And from Saarburg, you can attack through the Severn Pass or Severn Gap down into Alsace. So maybe if we can go to the next one. Yeah, you can see a little bit closer here, the two green lines of the German positions, the forward line and then the line on the Vosges itself. And then to the east of the Vosges Mountains, you get the plain of Alsace and then Strasbourg itself, which had another line of defenses around it. So in this part of the attack, there was some difficulty in taking the two German lines before the Vosges and on the Vosges itself and into the Severn Gap. But once Leclerc and his men were able to get into the Severn Gap there with Dio responsible for a lot of the lead in the fight there. There's still a lot of pockets of resistance all over the mountains, but Leclerc got word from some of the Alsatian resistance that the routes to Strasbourg itself were open. And so Leclerc had to make a decision here: is do I leave some security behind to deal with mopping up these pockets in the mountains and attack Strasbourg? Do I make sure that I've got a secure position to attack from and stay here, but then run the risk of the Germans reinforcing Strasbourg? And he decided to go for it and to move on what seemed to be open routes towards Strasbourg. But then he gave Dio what Dio certainly saw as a sad mission, which was, I need you to stay behind and take care of mopping up this resistance until the Americans catch up and can relieve you. And so for finally this culminating, this final big event, the climax of attack on Strasbourg, Dio was left behind in the mountains to clean up the resistance. And in fact, that's what happened. But it was one of his subordinate units that led the attack into Strasbourg.
And so as soon as he arrived in Strasbourg, Dio asked, where is Leclerc? Leclerc was in the Kaiser Palace, the palace of the emperor, having lunch with one of his aides-de-camp and chief intelligence officer. And as soon as Leclerc sees Dio, his face lights up and he say, hey, my old Dio, here we are this time. Now we can both croak. At this moment, they hear an artillery blast and an enormous chandelier smashed to the floor with a terrible crash, and the room filled with smoke. The desk was stripped bare by the blast, the window frame had fallen to the armchair, glass was everywhere. The curtains hung lamentably against a background of flames and smoke. Cars were burning around the Kaiser Palace. Colonel Dio was the first to stand up, putting his hand to the back of his neck. The general's first reaction, turning to Dio, was, Dio, are you hurt? No, no, mon général, I have nothing. For the aide-de-camp of Leclerc who witnessed this situation, it was so clear, the affection, the respect that Leclerc had for Dio sort of exploded at this moment. And then, after the fall of Strasbourg, they will continue, but Dio wanted to make sure that General Philippe, who had been so helpful to the French, will be made an honorary corporal of the Régiment de Marche du Tchad. And so here you see General Philippe beaming with pleasure to be surrounded by these Frenchmen who were so helpful on the road.
Yeah. And he really does look pleased in that picture too, and one of the reasons I really like this story of Dio and like telling this story is that for many, certainly Americans, I don't know about the Brits, this feeling that the French didn't fight in World War II, and it's absolutely not true. As you look at these men here who had been fighting for years by this point, and Hayslip, I think, is genuinely pleased to be considered one of them, as he's made an honorary corporal here. Mm-hmm. Okay, so then here's another one of those familiar moments. There's all these moments that we don't know a lot about, but then there's Berchtesgaden and Hitler's Eagle's Nest, and the question of who was the first one there.
I'm eagerly awaiting what you're going to say, you two.
So who made it? Well, I am personally a veteran of not just the 101st Airborne Division, but of the 506th Infantry Regiment.
Okay, mixed, divided loyalties.
The band of brothers themselves. And so that is the unit I went to Afghanistan with. And I know that there is an opinion there. There's also an opinion if you ask the 3rd Infantry Division, who says
John McManus would be putting his vote in for the 3rd Infantry. Yeah, it's...
And then of course there's the French claim, and so I'll say that's who did it. It was one of those three, was the first to reach Hitler's Eagle's Nest. Now, so what we do know, what I think I'm pretty confident in saying, is that when the French Second Armored Division made it to Berchtesgaden, everyone knew that this was a stronghold. This was potentially going to be the Nazi holdout here. This is where Hitler's final stand is going to be. This was the belief. Now, the U.S. Second Infantry or Third Infantry Division was supposed to be moving on towards Austria, but couldn't pass this up. Here's Berchtesgaden, so you get the Third Infantry Division coming in, and it appears that John McDaniel, commanding the division, had given orders to kind of slow these Frenchmen down, block them, so we can make sure we're the first ones in. And they were, in fact, the Third Infantry Division were the first ones into Berchtesgaden. But from the reports from the French is that, yes, that's true, but they didn't seem to know where the Eagle's Nest was, and that it was a Frenchman who was first to climb the slopes up there, either on foot or in a Jeep, got up there, identified it, came back down. They went looking for a flag that they could hoist on it. They didn't happen to have a French flag with them, but they found a massive Dutch flag, which can be turned 90 degrees sideways and become a French flag. And so this is what they did. And they went and hung this flag up on the Eagle's Nest. But then somewhere after that, there's debate on whether the 506th Regiment made it up there from the 101st Airborne Division, or whether it was the 7th Infantry Regiment from the 3rd Infantry Division. And my historian's answer is, I don't know.
It's just a fence sitting, but that's welcome to the club. We like being nuanced and not, but yeah, it becomes, as you said, the definition of, is it the Eagle's Nest itself? Does the village count? Does arriving in the area count? It's I've heard all the arguments, and at the end of the day, it doesn't really matter. Let's just agree they all got there at pretty much the same time.
The Allies took it. That's who took it.
The Allies took it, yeah.
Exactly. And there is also a difference that many people don't make between the Eagle's Nest and between the Berghof.
Yeah.
And so those are the, where I don't think that Americans always understand when you speak about it, what the Berghof was, which was the home where Hitler was, and the Eagle's Nest, which was a kind of a cabin on top of the mountain. So anyhow, I'm just being French here.
All right, so we've been moving rapidly through this, and I know there's a lot there, and I'm hoping that if you want to learn more, you'll buy the book and look into it yourself. But we're going to wrap this up here fairly quickly, and maybe have some time for some questions. But after shortly after this seizure of Berchtesgaden, we get VE Day and the war's over. In Europe, at least, but in the Pacific, it still continued. And for the French, that meant the need to liberate or regain control over French Indochina, which had been occupied by the Japanese. And for that mission, Leclerc was identified. And so he was finished with his command of the 2nd Armored Division, was going to head to Indochina for the end of the war here. And Leclerc advocated for Dio to take command of the division. And this seems to make sense. Dio had been his right-hand man all the way through, but we have to remember that Dio was still just a colonel, division typically commanded by a major general. And there were other French major generals and brigadier generals who were available to take the command. But Leclerc lobbied pretty hard for Dio to take command, and that is, in fact, what happened. So we see Colonel Dio taking command of the French 2nd Armored Division at the end of the war.
Yes, and Dio was really trying to even have his nomination as commander of the French 2nd Armored Division published after 2 months since he has taken command. And you see him here waiting in the headquarters in Fontainebleau. And then just after he received the command officially, came this wonderful honor from the United States. And I think that it's something that created also an incredible amount of jealousy in the French army to see Dio, who was, you had so many French soldiers who were not taken the right side, if you want, the right side at the end of the war in the army. And so they were really delaying everything for Dio and the division. So now, Jason, I leave you up with General Patch. With with General Hayslip.
Right,
The only thing I wanted to say was General Patch called the men of the Second Armored Division the crack troops.
The crack troop. Yeah, and I just want to clarify or point out that the Presidential Unit Citation is the highest award that a unit can receive in the American system. And again, I think Hayslip really truly did admire the Second Armored Division and the men and women of the unit. And you see him here ensuring that they got that recognition, hanging the streamer, indicating that they are a Presidential Unit Citation recipient, and reviewing the troops there. Must have been a great moment. You're here at the end of the war, to see we've done it. Everything we set out to do, we've done it, and now you can feel some pride in that a little bit.
And here it's just a quick slide to show you how the promotion of Dio happened. Through the ranks, and I will go a little bit more quickly now because to leave some time for question. And here you have Dio in Saint-Germain-en-Laye, and at the time, Jason, do you want to speak a little bit about this, or do you?
Yeah, well, I just maybe to point out one thing is that we talked about in the beginning of the war, you question loyalties and trying to figure out who's on which side and negotiating some difficult scenarios. People maybe you really respect a lot, but I'm not really sure which side they're on, and all that. Well, the end of the war is going to bring some of that stuff back, right? Because de Gaulle himself had been a brigadier general and even just a temporary brigadier general at the beginning of the war, and had rallied to him others. He'd promoted others to ranks even above himself. It's because so what does it mean? Now that the war is over, the emergency has passed, what does it mean for the future of France? And who was with us and who was against us? And then even within those who joined together and fought against the Germans, you've got de Gaulle and his Free French, but then there was also these others who joined later who had not been the Free French, and that included a lot of senior generals who joined a little bit later, and politicians. And so now after the war, what becomes of France and who's in charge and how do we transition power and all that? And so in the midst of all that, I think it was important for de Gaulle to place the Second Armored Division near Paris. And I'm not making any implications there, but it seems prudent, that I don't know what the future is going to be. And so let's keep my troops here nearby. And so that's why they're there. But you see here, Dio finally wearing the 2 stars of a brigadier general.
Yes, but then after de Gaulle left in early 1946, partly because of all of those jealousies, the Second Armored Division is transformed into the Second Armored Brigade.
Yeah, reduced in size.
Yes, and Dio suffers through that because he feels he has not been able to keep alive the heritage from Leclerc. But Leclerc understood that very well, and here he is on his return from Indochina, coming to visit the Second Armored Division. During that same period, there was the inauguration of the Maison des Anciens de la Deuxième DB, which was an association created according to Leclerc's wish. And he asked that all the soldiers after the war could rejoin their comrades, their chiefs, and continue on their path. He called that a maison and not an association because he wanted to give the feeling that this was their home. So here is the day where the inauguration of this Mission des Anciens happens. And here you see Dio with Michelet. And I am pointing out here, and I am showing a book that was republished about Edmond Michelet. Edmond Michelet was in the concentration camp of Dachau from 1943 and was the one last one to leave on May 26, 1945. He didn't want to leave before any of his French companions had left. And so Dio and Michelet certainly met when Dio visited the Dachau concentration camp. And so it's a very moving story. And I think for French people, the book is wonderful reading, but it's I don't think it's translated. Anyhow, after this period, Dio is sent to Tunisia, and after Tunisia, in Tunisia, he commands the troop of the southern part of Tunisia. Jason, would you like to say something about this slide?
Yeah, sure. The next one maybe is a little bit.
Sorry.
We see that.
Here,
it is.
Yeah,
To wrap up Dio's career, he spent 20 more years after the war still in uniform and still serving, eventually retiring as Monique's going to show us here in a minute, a Général d'Armée, or General of the Army, which is the equivalent of an American 4-star general, or a full general in the British system. So 5 stars on his sleeve there, which is the equivalent of 4-star. And that's where he ended his career. But in those 20 years after the war, as Monique said, spent a couple of years in Tunisia, commanding in southern Tunisia, and then was sent after that to Cambodia, where he commanded the Cambodian land forces from 50 to 52, and then back to French Equatorial Africa in Cameroon. And then following that, he, that period in Cameroon, he called the happiest period of his life. After the war there, back in Cameroon with something that was familiar and comfortable to him. And then eventually went on to become the Inspector General of the French Army before he retired in 1965. So here we see this is that period in Cameroon. He could go back to some of his old friends, and this is the Alifa of Mao, who's one of the local leaders there who had helped Dio early on. And so it's again, kind of a homecoming, a chance after the war to come back and to settle down a little bit. And then here he is promoted in 1965 to general, and then retired in 69. And that's him for his adieu des armes, or his retirement ceremony at Les Invalides in Paris.
Wow.
And that concludes.
I mean, brilliant stuff, Monique and Jason. A few questions for you. Most of them, I think, you answered them as you went along, really. But I think the big one, I think it reflected by that last but one slide there. Gary August asked earlier, do Monique and Jason think Dio's greatest achievement overall was his understanding, embracing, and living within the African cultures he came into direct contact with? I mean, it seems, you said it yourself, Jason, that period there in Africa in the 50s was the happiest period of his life. The swarthy desert fighter he had been 20 years earlier suggests he liked, from his camel days right the way through. Would you agree that was his biggest contribution in some ways?
I will definitely agree. It was extremely important to him. But because we are arriving to the end of our talk, I will also say, with all my gratitude for Colonel Jason Musteen, because he has translated on a voluntary basis and out of the generosity of his heart, his book about General Dio. And I am incredibly grateful to him, as is General Michel.
Brilliant. Well, that's nice. And Jason, your comment on his involvement in Africa there, do you see that as, you were in the American military, and which has always been going through that. We're talking about recently on the channel about Harry Truman, the anger he had in 1945 for what was happening to some of the African Americans back in the USA, and then you have desegregation. It's cultures, and it's still a thing that all of our armies are dealing with. That how you integrate, how you distinct. Would you agree that was one of his biggest legacies? Is that something you were impressed by?
It was, and I'll say that you can. I mean, you read the story and you can certainly see things. You look at the big picture of World War II, and you think for the Free French liberating Paris, or maybe Strasbourg. These were the important things. But really, all of those things are predicated upon. I mean, I don't think it's an exaggeration to go all the way back to say it was Dio, young Captain Dio, telling Leclerc, "I'll go get my men." That it was at that point, because without that, you wouldn't have had the Trois Glorieuses and the rallying of French Equatorial Africa, and with that, so it was the first step that had to happen, and that couldn't happen if Dio had not already earned the respect of his men in Africa, and if he didn't already spend the time to learn the languages, the customs, the cultures, and there's a lot of little stories we've left out about how he had done that. Now, when you can also look at it in today's thinking and say, well, this was a colonial force, colonial army. There's racism built into all this. It's a different time, different scenario. But I'll add that in the 50s, when he was back in Africa, Dio was responsible for some decolonization as well, and he made sure that as best as he could, that what the French left behind were local national forces that could defend themselves, and that he tried to help ease that transition as best as he could in the decolonization period as well. And so I'm not making any excuses for colonization or what that was like, but just to say that as an individual, as a man, Dio clearly had a lot of respect for the indigenous troops, forces, leaders, and peoples with whom he worked in the African continent, and that was absolutely necessary. In the beginning of the story.
Clearly leaving a legacy, trying to leave some hints of tradition, but also, like letting your children, leave the nest kind of thing, understanding that these nations will want to take their own path as they move forward. So that transition period, I think, is interesting. Well, we had another question I'll put to, I think, possibly to you, Jason, you're the sort of military side of things. And Scott's asking about, since the French Second Armored were equipped with the US, what issues, if any, did it cause with other French forces that had British backing? So I'm going to change the wording of that slightly to kind of reference in 1945, because the world is changing. We had Michael Nyberg on a few weeks ago talking about Potsdam and the conferences, and people are thinking beyond the Second World War to the future and problems of the Cold War and empire and all those issues there. You've got French units that serve with the British, some of the Bomber Command units, the SAS, things like that. And you've got the Second Armored that were with Americans. Did that, not so much the equipment, but that having allied yourself with one of the allies, did it cause any friction amongst those who'd been with the Brits and those who'd been with the Americans at the end of the war? Was there a kind of a hierarchy you felt?
I'm not sure. I'll start with that and say I don't have complete confidence in my answer, except I do know that the way that played out, whether the unit serving under British command or American command, that some of that played out based on time and location at which those French forces were established. And I know that there's certainly among the veterans of the Second Armored Division was the understanding and the feeling that we were first, that we were there from the beginning, and then because of that, eventually wound up under the American command, as opposed to those who were established and formed later or converted later from existing French units into Free French forces, if you will. But I don't know that it was really a jealousy based on whether you worked with or for the Americans and the Brits, as much as it was when you chose to align yourself with de Gaulle.
No, I agree. I think both of your points earlier about making it clear that there had been this rallying cry, there had been this call to arms as early as 1940. Because I mean, living in Normandy as I do, I've heard people look at the French Second Armored Division monument on Utah Beach and it sort of imply, well, that's where they started their war. Well, as you said, they had the transition from an infantry unit to an army unit, but the implication, okay, that you said there were lots of new troops that making up, but the core leadership, the core experience had been through years of fighting before they set foot on Utah Beach, and I think sometimes that's been overshadowed a bit. So I'm very grateful for you two to remind us of the long journey in time and in miles or kilometers, as I guess we're talking about French. You mentioned. We have one last question for you. I'm assuming a French viewer there, Alexander Serron, did he end up having a better career than General Massu? The latter is more well known in France. I mean, that's another French officer who lived a long time, died in 2002. I'm just checking on Wikipedia. Do you think he had a better? It's subjective, but a better career than Massu?
I think Monique might answer part of this, but I will point out that Massu is a part of this whole story. He was right there with. Yeah, right there in the middle of all this with Dio. But Monique, did you want to say something about his later experiences in Algeria?
I just want to say that there was a great respect between the two men, a lot of affection. Massu married the Rochambelles, so he was really part of it. But at some point, at the time of the war in Algeria, the Algerian war, there was a time where de Gaulle was really not very happy with Massu. And it is said that it was Dio that went to repair the link. At the same time, it is absolutely true that in May of '68, it was Massu that came with, de Gaulle had gone to see Massu in Germany when the situation was so bad in France. So I will say that, they were companion of arms, and that's what they felt all of their life.
Okay, thank you. And we're back kind of at where we were at the beginning, de Gaulle looming so large over French history. Quite rightly so. And Michael Nyberg, who's been in the sidebar, is a big fan of de Gaulle, and what an astute politician he was, because he straddled the military world, the political world, and a kind of the public publicity world as well. He happy to know all those areas. So we will bring things to an end. So it's been absolutely fantastic. I think everybody's agreeing in the sidebar there that you've brought a subject we didn't know much about and brought it alive and reminded us of things we should know more about. And what a colorful figure. So I'll hold up, I'll put it on my screen for a second. I'll hold up my book there, my version there. So the link, I say, is in the description below. We all could do with brushing up on our knowledge of the French participation in World War II. So there you are. There's the opportunity, folks. So thank you very much. It's been fantastic talking to you. Any more plans for any more World War II studies? Any moving sideways into a general history of the French Second Armored Division? Either of you, both of you? Can we see more books?
I will tell you, I'm currently working on translating and editing a collection of letters from World War I that French soldiers wrote, and so that's hopefully my next publication.
Brilliant stuff. Okay, well, thank you, both of you. Folks, as I said earlier, I'm off for a few days leading my tour. We'll be back again on October the 9th. Lucy Betteridge Dyson is returning to the channel to talk about Jungle Commandos. Roger Morehouse is back the next day talking about Wolfpack, the German U-boat war, and then there's lots more stuff coming away all through October, November, December, and as long as I keep doing it. So again, as always, folks, click like and subscribe. Consider becoming a patron. Thank you to all the new patrons who signed up recently. Thank you to those who go and buy the books. I will see you all again after my break. Cheers, everybody. Bye.